What did you do at USCIS?
Okay, well, my name is Eric. I'm a former adjudicator at United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. When I say adjudicator, that means that I was in charge of adjudicating some of the more popular benefit forms like green card applications and citizenship applications. That's a role that usually involves several years of agency experience, but in my case, I was coming over from another government agency, so I moved into that position, kind of a lateral move, and I did that for about 2 years before I moved on to another private sector opportunity.
Got it. Can you explain how immigration enforcement works nowadays under the Biden administration?
Wow, that's a big question. And it involves a lot of different agencies that don't always work very well together.
Can you elaborate that?
Sure, absolutely. Maybe it'd be good to kind of look at where most people's immigration journey begins, and then talk about how enforcement gets involved at different points. So, if you enter the United States on a visa, then at the interview at the consulate overseas, or at the point at which you asked the USCIS for permission to have that status in the United States, they looked at you. They looked at your information and your history, and they made a decision about whether you were eligible for the type of visa or status that you were looking for. So at that point, they basically said, okay, under certain conditions with certain rules, you're allowed to enter or be in the United States. Now, where enforcement gets involved is, if you violate the terms of the specific visa or status that you're given, then you are put into a, let's call it a queue, for enforcement. And there's different forms of enforcement. Some enforcement involves, you being removed from the United States by, an immigration judge's decision. Other types of penalties or violations result in you maybe being ineligible for future visas or ineligible to use programs like visa waiver. These are enforced by the agencies that make decisions about the visas and statuses that you're looking for. So, for example, if you have a student visa and you enter the United States and you don't go to school, and then you leave the United States and apply for another student visa in your home country, then the Department of State and the consular officer who does your interview will inform you that you have violated U.S. immigration law and that you're not eligible for a visa. Other people, I think what most Americans associate with immigration enforcement is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, the agency. And this is the agency that at the point at which you have either been designated by an immigration judge or other immigration official as removable, or you have been passed to them by U.S. law enforcement, your information is passed from perhaps a local or state law enforcement agency to the federal agency, which is more commonly called ICE. They will make a decision based on their policies and regulations about whether you should be removed from the United States. And that removal can take many forms. It's a complicated legal process that includes court appeals and attorneys, and in many cases can take several years to completely play out. But that is immigration enforcement in a nutshell.
Great. How does USCIS know if you go out of status? Say you're living in the country and all of a sudden you go out of status. Are they made aware of that? How do they see people going out of status?
Yeah, another question that can be quite complicated in practice, but the way most people experience this is when you enter the United States on your visa, if you have a non-immigrant visa, that's to say, if you don't have the type of visa which instantly becomes or transforms into a green card when you begin living in the United States, if you have a tourist visa, a student visa, many types of work visas like the H-1B, you're given a very specific set of circumstances that you can continue to use that visa in the US, right? So all the policies and rules that I just mentioned, but you're also given a duration of status. So for a B1, B2 tourist visa holder who enters the United States, one of the questions that you'll be asked at the port of entry is, what are you going to do in the United States? And according to what you say, they will then make a decision about how long you're allowed to stay. Can be up to 6 months on that type of visa. And then essentially you're allowed to do whatever you want in the United States, again, not in accordance with the visa type. For tourist visa, people can't work. People with employment visas, there's certain other activities that they can't engage in. They can't easily change employers in most cases. But as long as you adhere to those rules, you're not going to have much of a problem. Now, you fall out of status when you fall outside those duration of status and those rules and policies that I mentioned, right? So for a tourist visa holder, you are technically out of status immediately following the date that your duration of status expires. Now, this is where the law gets a little complicated, because I said out of status, but what most people are concerned with when they hear that is what is actually in legal terms called unlawful presence. And that begins to accrue at different points depending on what your original status was. But let's say in the tourist visa example, at which point you have been out of status for 180 days or more, you then begin to accrue unlawful presence. Unlawful presence is what triggers these bars from re-entering the US that many people have a difficult time overcoming in the immigration process. So those can be 3-year bars, 5-year bars, 10-year, 20-year bars, and also permanent bars for certain types of immigration violations, usually having to do with criminal activity. So to go back to the original question, USCIS is not an agency that's charged with actively enforcing the maintenance of status for specific people. Usually where USCIS gets involved with determining your status is when you make applications for follow-on benefits. That is to say, if you were out of status on your tourist visa, and then you decided that you wanted to change status to another type of visa, you would make that application to USCIS, and they would identify the fact that you were ineligible for that benefit and inform you of that. And usually at the point at which you're informed that you're out of status and that you will not be granted the benefit that you applied for, that initiates a process which alerts other immigration-related agencies that you perhaps need to be looked at and visited by other officers. And they have a priority list, and this is discussed in the news quite often. Certain types of violations or certain types of people and relationships are focused on more than others. I won't really get into that because it's constantly changing. But suffice it to say, that's kind of where USCIS gets involved in the status and maintenance of status question. Now, like the other way that people encounter immigration enforcement, as I mentioned earlier, if you are out of status, even if you're not actively seeking some sort of benefit from USCIS, if you are involved with law enforcement, even non-federal law enforcement, depending on the relationship that those local and state authorities have with the federal immigration authorities, you can be flagged and processed for immigration-related enforcement in that scenario as well.
So it sounds like it really is up to the immigrants' actions and behaviors when they come into contact with that enforcement type situation. And USCIS has a system more so designated to deter future immigrants who have broken those rules.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to characterize it. The way that most people get, the problem for most people is that these periods that you remain in the US without status can be very long. And we all know in the course of a normal person's lifetime that people make mistakes. So if we were talking about a small period of time, like a month or two, yeah, it'd be easy to be careful and be conscientious and be very, avoid these scenarios that could put you in trouble. But in the span of years or decades, the idea that you'll never get a traffic ticket or you'll never, encounter the police in some kind of like DUI type situation. And these are things that happen in life, and those are mistakes that people make. And for a normal, for a person who's in the United States with some sort of legal status, they have different ways that they could address these mistakes and without that won't adversely or seriously harm them in terms of their ability to remain in the United States. But it's very challenging for undocumented folks or folks who are out of status because, potentially minor violations and encounters with law enforcement can lead to extremely serious immigration related consequences because, they are in effect in a constant violation of immigration law during the period that they're in the States and out of status.
Gotcha. And then what happens when you marry a US citizen and you go out of status? I'd often get panicked couples who were worried that they were gonna that their status was going to fall out before they submitted an application to USCIS. Is their fear unfounded or founded?
This one's it's possible to be too reassuring in this scenario. You have to remember that when somebody is out of status, regardless of what benefits or relationships that they have, you know, at the bottom of the situation is the fact that they just don't have legal permission to be in the United States. So even if you marry an American citizen and you're planning to file some sort of application, which you may be eligible for, because there's many of the policies and restrictions that I mentioned earlier that are not applicable when somebody is marrying an American citizen, that would be applicable in other immigration scenarios. But in the meantime, you know, until that benefit is approved or that employment authorization document is issued, then yes, you're subject to the normal rules that every other person would be subject to who was out of status, regardless of how you entered the United States originally or other factors in your case. So it can be a little bit dangerous to be in that out of status scenario for a long time, even if you have a US citizen spouse. So in that sense, most people who marry an American citizen would look carefully at their immigration situation, in addition to their financial situation and their family and all the other things that we know have an impact on these decisions, and you know, make attempts to address these immigration questions as soon as they could.